Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson from Unit 3, American Federalism, is Lesson 3, about the first delegation of power in the creation of a federal system of government. In this lesson, you will learn about the original distribution of power, the source of government power, the original delegation of power, and about foreign fears and local trust that influenced the nature of American federalism. Now, beginning in this lesson, and for several lessons to come, we're going to be building a model of American federalism. But to start building that model, we have to first recall the state of nature. This is a concept that was discussed very early in the course. Remember that in the state of nature, we're talking about a world without government. The colonists in what would become the 13 states that originally formed the United States briefly fell into the state of nature after they declared independence from Great Britain. And it was only then, when they quickly formed state constitutions, that they stepped out of that state of nature back into civil society with a legitimate government ruling over them. The reason they were briefly in the state of nature is that their local governments derived their authority from the king. Once they rejected the authority of the king, they also rejected the authority of those local governments. And they were left without legitimate government until they, as people, using their sovereign power, remember popular sovereignty, created their own state governments, which they did very quickly. This notion of being in the state of nature is really a theoretical one, because as a practical matter, they didn't suddenly turn savage after declaring independence, became lawless marauders until they formed state governments. They continued to act as responsible citizens and quickly formed their state governments. But it's an important theoretical step for them to go through. And we can illustrate this by creating a Venn diagram. Now, Venn diagrams involve circles that overlap, and some are found inside of others that show relationships between things. So we begin our diagram of American federalism with a simple gray circle. And what we want the area of this simple gray circle to represent is all the freedoms, powers, rights possessed by individuals in the state of nature. It's this circle that encompasses all those powers possessed by people in the state of nature, which will be the foundational building block of our diagram of American federalism. Now, as we consider that foundational block, that gray circle representing the powers that people have in the state of nature, we should ask ourselves, well, just how much power was there? Well, if we accept the idea of John Locke, remember we discussed him earlier in the course, the English philosopher who theorized about the state of nature and the social contract, and was very influential on the founding of the United States of America. Well, if we look to the ideas of John Locke, we'll see that he argued that in the state of nature, people had perfect and absolute freedom to do anything that they wanted. So the original distribution of political power, represented by this first gray circle, is total and absolute freedom to do anything. It's all those powers that any individual could have to do anything that they were capable of doing without interference from any governmental power around them. So, in the state of nature, people are completely free to do anything. But, as I mentioned a moment ago, when I talked about the formation of the state governments here in the United States of America after the Declaration of Independence, people aren't going to want to stay in this state of nature, even though they have all this freedom and power. And to remember why, we have to recall the creation of governments through the social contract. Remember from much earlier in the course, this is the idea that people be willing to give up a chunk of those freedoms that they had in the state of nature in exchange for a government that could bring some order and safety and security to their lives. So if we turn back to John Locke again, he argued that you only get a political society where people are willing to give up those natural powers that they had in the state of nature and hand them over to a government. So this then provides us with a very important notion as we build our model of American federalism. And that is that powers that are assigned to a state or a government to rule over the people are powers that the people individually held themselves first, supremely within the sphere of their control. They were each individually sovereign over their own lives without any outside power being able to tell them what to do. And then through the social contract, they turn over a certain amount of that power to a state government. So state governments' powers are derived from the powers that people held individually before. So then we have to ask ourselves, if the people are turning their individual power over to create a state government, how much power are they turning over? Well, back to John Locke, according to him, they give up all power that is necessary for the ends for which they are creating their government. As they come out of the state of nature, they create a government to do certain things for them, maybe protect their lives or protect their property or maybe both. And they turn over enough power to that government for it to successfully perform the functions that they're assigning to it. Well, what about specifically here in the creation of the states that became the United States of America? How much power did that founding generation feel that they needed to turn over to their state governments? We can get a clue about that by looking to the writings of people who lived during that time who thought about these things. One prominent example of a thinker and what he had to say about this was an American politician, Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers who was at the Constitutional Convention, who served in the first government over the United States of America under President George Washington. Alexander Hamilton was a prominent politician in New York, and he spoke up during their state ratifying convention when they were considering whether to accept the Constitution or not. He was very much in favor of the Constitution. And in his speech before that convention, he made this very interesting point. He said that in the first formation of government, he's talking about when the states are created, by individuals coming together and creating them. He said every power of the community is delegated. In other words, every power these individuals have is turned over to the government so that it can extend to every possible object. It can take care of everything that can possibly be taken care of in their lives. He says nothing is reserved or kept back by them, but the inalienable rights of mankind. Now that last part there about the inalienable rights of mankind, we're going to talk about that a lot more in a future lesson. For right now, just take this idea that he has that in the formation of the states, like the state of New York, the state of Georgia, the state of North Carolina, whatever, that the people who formed those states turned essentially all power over to their governments, so their governments could address any need, what it might be. Now that idea of people turning massive amounts of power over to their local state governments may seem to conflict with an idea that you learned earlier in this course, that Americans, the founding Americans, the colonial Americans, were generally classical liberals who'd come to America to get away from government. Now, while at first it may seem contradictory for people who want to get away from government, when they first have the chance to make government, they end up giving that government tremendous power. But it's not really contradictory if you realize what life was really like for them in America and whose power they were concerned about that they wanted to get away from. Look at these three maps from the time of the founding of the United States of America. The one on the left represents population density. You can see that there are very few people living in the interior. Most people lived on the coasts. You get out in the countryside and it's wide spread out farms. So The populations were relatively small, and they were concentrated along the coastlines. If you look at the second map, it shows where the people were coming from who settled in America. For example, look at the Pennsylvania, toward the middle of the map, just slightly above the middle. And there's a gray patch where Pennsylvania got a lot of people from Germany. If you look down toward the bottom of the map, South Carolina, along its rivers, there's a shade of blue which corresponds in the key to Scots-Irish settlers. So you can see that different areas were settled by groups from different countries in Europe. And then you look at the far right map and you see divisions based on religion. So for example, you get a bunch of Lutherans settling in Pennsylvania. There were Germans settling there, they were Lutherans. While up in Massachusetts, you get lots of Congregationalists. And down in North Carolina, virtually all the settlers were Anglican. So what do we get from these maps? What do these teach us about the nature of the population among these newly independent states at the time of the founding? And what that has to do with the people in those states being willing to turn over lots of power to their state governments at the same time that they had fought a war to get away from a powerful government in England. What it tells us is that the states were granted broad powers because the populations within those states were small, and in terms of ethnicity, culture, economic goals, and religion, they were generally homogeneous. You would have white, Puritan, Congregationalists from England living in Massachusetts, while you might have German Lutherans living in Pennsylvania. Because the people within a given state were very much like each other, they were very much more comfortable turning lots of power over to their state governments, which was full of people like them also, who they felt that they could trust with that power, to do with it what they would do themselves if they were in the government. You would feel a lot more comfortable turning power over to a government filled with people who you consider to be just like you than to some other government that's across on an ocean away with people with different religious beliefs, etc. And that was the problem with them wanting a distant government to have power over them. It felt foreign to them, different, separate. And we're talking about either a central government back in London or after the founding of the United States of America, a central government in Washington, D.C. For someone growing up in, say, Georgia, the idea of a government off somewhere else in the country, having authority over them in Georgia, but that government off elsewhere being filled with people from New York and Virginia and Massachusetts, then bossing people in Georgia around to tell them what to do, was a scary proposition they wanted to stay away from. So they wanted to give that government very limited powers, that foreign government, so to speak, in Washington, D.C., while their local state government full of people like them, with the same backgrounds, the same beliefs, they'd feel a lot more comfortable giving it extensive powers. All right, so now let's review what we learned in this lesson. First of all, where was all the governmental power originally held? Was it held by individuals, by states, by central governments, or by kings? Well, according to social contract theory, which theorizes about the state of nature, governmental power was originally held by individuals. Now, we're using governmental power here a little bit of stretch, the power to rule. But the individual only rules himself. He's a government of one over one. But that's where the power existed, which then people came together as groups to turn it over to a government entity like a state. What is the source of state power? Do states get their power from assignment from the central government? Do they inherit it from a monarch? Is it just simply assumed at the time that states are created? Or is it delegated to them from individuals? Of course, the correct answer is that states get their power by delegation from individuals. People, individually, turn power over to states. That's the nature of social contract theory. Well, then, how much power was delegated to states, here within the United States of America. When the states were originally created, were they only given limited duties, or inalienable rights, or enumerated powers? Or were they given all powers needed to perform their functions, whatever they were? Well, at least according to Alexander Hamilton, they were given all powers needed. Well, Alexander Hamilton and John Locke, who theorized about it too. Why give more power to states than to a central government? Is it because the states were familiar? That the central government was foreign? That states were homogeneous? In other words, that the people there were all pretty much the same? Or is it the states were more trusted than a distant central government would be? Well, it's kind of a trick question. All those answers are correct. All right, that does it for this lesson about the first delegation of power. Our next lesson from Unit 3 will be Lesson 4 about the police power.